My name is Eric Taylor, and I'm a student here at Stanford University. Today I'm going to talk about research on teacher evaluation. In particular, I've been asked to talk about a study in which we measure the effect of evaluation on the performance of the teachers who are being evaluated. In other words, what we wanted to test was, does the experience or the process of being evaluated change or improve the quality of a teacher's work, the quality of her teaching? Teacher evaluation is a hot topic in public schools today. Lots of districts, lots of states are redesigning and expanding their teacher evaluation programs. And so schools, policymakers, researchers have all been spending a lot of time in recent years and a lot of effort on teacher evaluation. There are lots of important questions to answer, like what exactly should we measure in our teacher evaluations? Can we make those measures more reliable or accurate? And how should we use the information? What incentives or consequences should we attach to a teacher's evaluation scores? Our research question was a little bit different. What we wanted to know is what was the impact of being evaluated on the teachers who had been evaluated? So in this research, we studied a well-established, long-running teacher evaluation program in Cincinnati. With the help of the Cincinnati Public School District, we were able to analyze nearly a decade worth of data on individual teacher performance. We tracked individual teachers over multiple years, measuring their performance each year, the years before they had been evaluated, the year during which they were being evaluated in the district's program, and the years after evaluation. And what we found is teacher performance, as measured by growth in student math test scores, that performance improved some during the time that the teacher was being evaluated. And those improvements didn't go away. Higher performance continued in the years after the teacher evaluation had ended. So my presentation today is going to be brief. I'll tell you a little bit more about Cincinnati's program, about our research results, and about how we're thinking about what those results mean. A complete description of our research is in an article titled "The Effect of Evaluation on Teacher Performance." There's also a less technical version of the article called "Can Teacher Evaluation Improve Teaching?" Links to both of those articles are available on the website of the Stanford Center for Education Policy Analysis. And both articles are a collaboration between myself and my co-author, John Tyler, at Brown University. So, a little bit more about Cincinnati's program. In Cincinnati, evaluation is known as the Teacher Evaluation System, or TES for short. And Cincinnati began using TES in the fall of the year 2000. The design of the program had been a collaboration between the local school district and the local teachers union. I should say that there have been some changes to the TES program in recent years, and so what I'll describe is really how TES functioned and operated during the years that we studied. So the first important feature of the TES program is that teachers' performance was measured primarily with classroom observations. A TES evaluation lasted an entire school year. And during that school year, teachers were observed multiple times in their classroom. Most observations were done by trained peer evaluators, other teachers who had been selected for this particular job based on their own past success in the classroom. And then at least one observation was done by the teacher's own school principal. As I mentioned, the evaluation lasted an entire school year, but teachers were not evaluated in every year. And that's important for our research design. It allows us to measure teacher performance in years when they weren't being evaluated. So I'll come back and say a little bit more about that later. During a teacher's observation, they were scored on dozens of individual teaching practices. And after each observation, they received feedback on those same practices. The work of the evaluators, their notes during observation, the scores that they gave, the feedback that they gave to teachers, were all structured around a very specific rubric that was designed based on something called the Framework for Teaching by Charlotte Danielson. So here's an example of two elements from that rubric. And it's probably a little bit hard to see in the video, but the full rubric is available from the district's website. And this particular example is in the articles that I mentioned before. So what you see here is two items on which teachers were evaluated. One is called engaging students in discourse, and the other is called using thought-provoking questions. And for these two items, and in fact for all of the practices on the rubric, the behavior of teachers, the practices of teachers is described in 4 levels, from unsatisfactory to distinguished. So for example, in this case, for a teacher to be rated as distinguished, the highest level, the teacher needed to structure and facilitate class discourse, routinely ask thought-provoking questions, and seek clarification and elaboration through additional questions. By contrast, an ineffective teacher was described as a teacher who permits off-topic discussions or does not elicit student responses and does not ask follow-up questions. The last thing to mention about the Cincinnati program is a little bit about the stakes for teachers. What was attached to the teachers' TES scores. So at the end of the school year, teachers received a formal score in 4 particular areas, though during the course of the school year, they received all of the detailed scores that I mentioned before. And these 4 final scores were the ones used for a teacher's evaluation. So high scores were required for some promotions in the district, and low scores, particularly low scores, triggered additional evaluation, and persistently low scores could be grounds for termination. So as you can tell, the Cincinnati program was intensive and detailed, and most of the features in the Cincinnati program were not common to teacher evaluation programs a decade ago, but they're increasingly common now. They show up in a lot of the new teacher evaluation programs being proposed or implemented by states and districts around the country. So we think that studying Cincinnati's experience gives us some information about what to expect from these new teacher evaluation programs. So in this research, we studied a sample of math teachers in grades 4 through 8 and their students. And importantly, all of the teachers in our study were working in the Cincinnati public schools before the TES program began in the year 2000. And that's important because we're able to measure their performance before they were evaluated. In fact, none of the veteran teachers in our study were evaluated before the fall of 2005 at the earliest. And that's because the timing of these veteran teachers' first evaluation was determined by a schedule that was worked out during the design of the TES program back before the year 2000. And that schedule was based solely on a teacher's year of hire. So, for example, a teacher hired in 1996 was first evaluated in the year 2006, and a teacher that was hired in the year 1998 was first evaluated in the year 2007. So, in that sense, teachers didn't have influence over when they would be evaluated. But because these teachers were already working in the district when the evaluation program began, we think of them as mid-career teachers because all of them had between 8 and 17 years of experience at the time when they were first evaluated by the district's program. Now, as I mentioned, the full details of our statistical analysis are available in the articles that I showed you earlier. But the basic idea is this. First, we measured each teacher's performance year by year. And then, for every particular teacher, we calculated the change in her performance, comparing her performance in the years after she had been evaluated to the years before she had been evaluated. And then finally, we calculated the average change across all of the teachers in our sample. So I think this figure gives some intuition for how our research design proceeded. And this shows you a couple of example teachers. On the x-axis is just the school year. We measured teachers' performance every single school year based on student test scores. On the y-axis is our measure of teacher performance. And as I mentioned, our measure of teacher performance is based on student test score growth in math. And you can think of the y-axis as the average test score growth of all the students in a teacher's class in a particular year. Now, it's important to mention that test scores were not part of the formal TES evaluation process. So our outcome variable in this research, student test score growth, was not something on which teachers were being evaluated at the time. So what you see in this in these examples is that the blue teacher was evaluated in the year 2006, and there was a noticeable increase in that teacher's performance after she had been evaluated. The red teacher was evaluated 1 year later in 2007. Now that red teacher started out with higher performance than the blue teacher, but her performance also increased somewhat, not as much, but increased somewhat after evaluation. And because each teacher was evaluated in a different year, and because the improvements happened after the evaluation had occurred, we have reasonable confidence that those improvements were a result of participating in the evaluation. So imagine that we did this one by one for every teacher in our sample, and then we took the average across all of the teachers in our sample. So in practice, our estimates come from a multivariate regression analysis, and sort of for the more technically minded listening today, the regression is a teacher fixed effects regression, and it's based on a design, an event study design, or an interrupted time series style design. So here are the results of our study. The black line on this graph shows you teacher performance over time. It's the average across all of the teachers in our sample. And the dotted lines show you the statistical confidence intervals of our estimates. The black square in the middle is the teacher's evaluation year, her performance during the year that she was going through the classroom observation-based evaluation in Cincinnati. The dots in the red box show you the years leading up to evaluation, and the dots in the blue box show you the years after evaluation. So there are a few things to notice about this graph. First is that average teacher performance doesn't really change all that much in the years leading up to the teacher's evaluation. But then teacher performance improves during the year that she was being evaluated. And those improvements were lasting. The performance remained higher in the years after the evaluation had occurred, years in which the teacher was not being evaluated. So what could have caused this pattern of results? Well, if the improvement had been temporary, if teacher performance had returned to prior levels after the evaluation had ended, after the evaluators were no longer watching, we might conclude that the teachers were just responding to the incentives of the evaluation, that they were only improving their performance when they were being scored. But that's not what happened. The improvements were not temporary, they were lasting. And those lasting improvements suggest a real change occurred in teachers' skills or effort. In fact, as we talk about more in the paper, the improvements were largest for the teachers who started out with the lowest levels of performance. That is, the teachers who had the most room to grow. So to summarize, what we found was that on average, the students of a teacher, a mid-career teacher, scored about 4.5 percentile points higher after she had been evaluated compared to the students that she taught before being evaluated. And these improvements were not one time and not just while the evaluators were watching. The improvements lasted for years after evaluation, suggesting that teachers made a real change in the quality of their teaching, a change that was induced by the process or the experience of evaluation. So we think these improvements are encouraging news for the potential of well-designed and well-executed teacher evaluation programs. But it's really just one example. So John Tyler and I, along with many others, are continuing to study how evaluation affects the teachers who are being evaluated. So thanks so much for being interested in our research.